Hello and welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm Hannah Mullaney, Client Solutions Director at Saville Assessment, and each episode I'll be joined by an industry expert to discuss the hottest topics in assessment today. Let's dive in. Hello. Today we're talking about emotional intelligence, or perhaps emotional responsiveness. I'm joined by Rab MacIver, Saville Assessment's very own Research and Development Director, and the brains behind Wave. So Rab, what is emotional intelligence and why does it matter?
Well, you're going back, people might think emotional intelligence is new, but I'm going back 30 years really to the start of my career in assessment. And emotional intelligence became a sort of buzzword at that point in time. And I think the main thing about emotional intelligence is it's one of those concepts that resonates as an idea that you should have some intelligence with your emotions. I kind of think they're two different things. Intelligence and emotions are two different things, but the idea of linking them is certainly intuitively appealing.
I certainly have probably weekly conversations with clients who are wanting to measure emotional intelligence. And when I dig into why, it tends to be to do with increasing receptiveness to feedback, getting better collaboration, building more empathetic leadership. Are those the sorts of things that you would pull out when you're thinking about emotional intelligence, or do you think it goes broader than that?
I suppose I'm not the greatest fan of the term emotional intelligence, as I kind of think they're two different things. So those are concepts that you would find in tools that are designed to measure what's called emotional intelligence. Personally, I think you can be intelligent with your emotions in understanding. So you can understand maybe yourself. You can understand how you are best to manage other people. You might have great self-awareness. You might have great understanding of other people and what drives their motivations and be empathetic towards them. But that doesn't mean that you act on those things. And that's, I think, the problem with emotional intelligence is just being intelligent in that respect doesn't mean that you do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And really what you're looking for is just what you said, the people that, really are receptive to feedback or they act on it. It's more than intelligence. So a good example of that, for example, that I sort of recently came across was somebody who was very extreme in terms of challenging. Now, even if they present themselves as extreme as a personality mentioned on challenging, so that's telling people that they disagree with them, perhaps even being prepared to be argumentative. That then, first of all, you want to understand what they're argumentative about. So you do need to understand the context because probably something might be a trigger for them. So it might be treating somebody unfairly might be a trigger for them. So even if you just know that one thing, you might not know what that looks like in practice, what they respond to. But this particular person also was much lower on the resolving area. So it's a bit like when they actually challenged, they might cause some heat in the situation very directly and maybe raise other people's emotions because they're being criticized or challenged, but they're not going to resolve it. So it's a bit like they start a fight, but they walk away and let it run. And you can see that person may well know that they're doing that from an emotional intelligence point of view, but they're still prepared to do it. That's how they respond, which I think is different to emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a delightful person to work with. So how to translate that into the more kind of traditional emotional intelligence questionnaires that are out there on the market? Would those pick that sort of stuff up or not really because they're not getting at the responsiveness piece?
I think they probably allow you to start a conversation. on those areas. So, and similarly, a personality questionnaire will allow you to start a question on those areas. Of course, the quality and the depth of the questionnaire and how it probes into those areas will help you in that conversation. So it's a bit like how good a start can you get in understanding how somebody would respond. But I wouldn't say that you shouldn't necessarily just rely completely on the responses, just an emotional intelligence, just to say that you've got an understanding without really having sort of a feedback and understanding of how that plays out in practice, or how emotional intelligence plays out in terms of how somebody actually would respond. So even if you're thinking about how somebody challenges somebody else, people can do that in very different ways. It can be very sort of direct. It can be just them saying no. It can be, more about sort of getting into an argument. And that might feel very different to the recipient. And remember, sometimes the recipient may want very different things. So I used to have a friend who I loved to argue with, and she used to love to argue with me. But we could clear a room when we were having a discussion because nobody else wanted to listen to it. If there was any sort of heat in the debate. So, it's not just, obviously you're not talking just about whether the reaction's appropriate, but is it appropriate to the receiver?
Okay. And so how should you go about measuring this idea of emotional responsiveness?
I think what you're looking at are tools. I mean, I would say Wave's a good example of one of those. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear. That was designed to actually measure behavioural action and activity. Not so much the sort of internal feelings necessarily, but how that actually plays out in reality.
Could you give us an example just to help bring that to life?
So, I mean, one of the things, for example, you do a lot of training. Historically, I've done a lot of training in my career. And of course, training's now different, isn't it? Because a lot of that's virtual. It used to be in person. We used to sit in classrooms and we could always see how somebody was reacting very sort of clearly. And we got the feedback, and it was much easier to do training in that environment. But one characteristic often you have is agreeableness, which is one of the big 5 personality dimensions. And agreeableness, a lot of that's built in around empathy, which is obviously a concept in emotional intelligence, sort of understanding the other person's position. Now, you can understand the other person's position, but if you write a question, for example, in a personality questionnaire, which says something like, I'm worried about other people's feelings, or I'm concerned about other people's feelings. Well, that's good, that you're concerned about other people's feelings, but it makes no difference to that person. You haven't done anything. So actually, so if you're a trainer, if you think about it, what do? You say, are you all right under that circumstance? Is there anything that I can do? Do you want to explain it? Or you go and look for an opportunity to speak to that person individually to sort of sound them out and check them. But you don't, sitting at the front of the room worrying about them isn't a useful trait. It's an emotionally intelligent thing that you've picked it up, but you haven't acted upon it. So it's to create assessments that measure active things that people do to make a difference, the things that they respond to.
Yeah. And I think the example, within Wave that I think you once shared it with me, and I then use that on a lot of training courses and use it in client conversations today when talking about the action orientation of Wave. So it's the extroversion versus going and building relationships example. So rather than writing a question that explores how extroverted somebody is, you write a question that asks, how good are you at building relationships?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, that's entirely right. You're trying to move beyond maybe just a sort of attitudinal stance. And that might be useful if you're exploring personality from an academic point of view to understand where somebody's coming from. But when you're trying to do raw prediction of performance of how to improve performance, how to measure performance, how to see who's more likely to perform well in a particular situation, the extroversion matters less than the building relationships. Now, they're tied together. Extroverts are more likely to be effective at building relationships. Of course, that's the case. But the responsive thing is, if the extrovert sits in the room, and some extroverts do this, they'll sit in the room wishing they had a lot of company. Some extroverts, sit there and they don't call up somebody to say, do you fancy going to the cinema? Mm-hmm. They just don't have the action orientation to do the thing that does them. Now, you could say that's a lack of emotional intelligence, that they can't take that action, to do something that's for their benefit. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, emotionally, as a response, it's probably not good for them. And that's the important thing, maybe.
And it's kind of the so what piece to it. Okay. And is emotional intelligence, or maybe we should start talking about emotional responsiveness now, how developable is it in people?
Yeah, if we look at, I suppose what I would try and do is I would sort of broaden out emotional responsiveness to responsiveness over other things. Mm-hmm. So you can respond to sort of emotions, you can respond to other people's emotions, but you can respond to other things. So we shouldn't forget that some people maybe aren't so tied up in the world of emotions as some other people. So if you go, for example, and you look at IT developers or some people that work in very sort of analytical financial positions, then they're much more tied up with getting things right and doing things in the correct way and being factually accurate and whatever else. So if they're going to challenge about something, right, they're not maybe going to are likely to challenge about something, let's say, that's sort of emotional or they're concerned. They're probably going to go, You've got that number wrong. You realise you've got that number wrong and be upset about it, about that thing. So I think you have to broaden out your understanding to a sort of wider set of personality, because emotions play out across personality. So I think the first thing I would say before sort of discussing it is just to almost say, right, well, if we look at personality characteristics, including ones that maybe are more tied or more thought of as related to emotional intelligence, how developable are they? We did a study that sort of tracked how things developed across the career, and that was called University, or the University of Life, we called the thing. And it was basically saying, if you looked at work experience or you looked at getting secondary education at a university or college, how did those impact your personality? How did your personality develop? And the things that did change were actually some of the things about, for example, creating innovation, some of the things actually even about drive. Maybe you switched on or off a little bit more over time, but once you learnt maybe your trade, maybe you became a bit more innovative in your trade because you had an understanding of maybe what you could do differently. But the things that didn't move were actually things like building relationships and communicating information. So if you go back to your extrovert example, in a way, if people are a bag of fun when you meet them at 20 years old, they'll probably make you laugh your socks off when they're 50. They'll be just the same, as engaging and charismatic interpersonally as they ever were. But similarly, if they bored you rigid, then it's unlikely 30 years ago that suddenly you're going to think, oh, let's go out for a drink together and have a laugh. It's probably not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean in practice for L&D or talent folk who I think spend a lot of time building leadership development programs focused on a lot of that people stuff?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. It's interesting now, isn't it, as leadership is changing for the for the period of that we won't mention what happened over the last time as we get bored of talking about it. But now we have to think about leadership more from a different lens. But I think anyway, even before that was the case and most leadership was in person, then the assumption that suddenly you were going to transform somebody into, being a leader that was sort of more, interpersonally affable and connected and whatever else was probably trying to make them something that they genuinely aren't. So, I'm not saying every leadership development program does that, but I think you're right that some probably spend a lot of time on those sort of leadership characteristics when they could be spending time on stuff that they can more easily develop and to have more benefit.
And I think it is interesting that people, I think, are still spending time focusing on trying to build those sorts of behaviours up across a leadership population, when actually, I guess some of the work we've been doing together over the last 18 months, Rab, on leadership identification has actually been more around what type of leader might you be, and sort of appreciating that there are different types of leadership. And so would you say that actually for some leaders, maybe to pick up on your point in about the post-pandemic world that we're now living in, is it okay for some leaders to not have this concept of emotional responsiveness, emotional intelligence? Can you get away without it now?
Yeah, probably. It depends what you're doing, and it depends who you're dealing with. I think people are emotionally sort of responsive in different ways. I mean, sometimes if you're, for example, in something that's very analytical, the worst thing, for example, would be an IT developer, might be if you're running a set of ideas or a Scrum team, that somebody comes in who is really emotionally intelligent and wants to, be responsive about all and talk about all of your emotion, when it's the last thing on earth you want to do. You want to get on with programming. And actually who you would value as a leader is a superstar programmer that you can respect and look up to, because that's what you come into work to do.
Yeah.
Your primary focus is getting the job done right. It's not all about, the managing relationships and some of the other things. Now, there may be other cases where it's very, very important that you've got somebody that's emotionally responsive in the right way, where, they're dealing with a number of difficult informations, very difficult situations, very challenging situations, and, being appropriately emotionally responsive is very important. But also, it doesn't necessarily have to come from one person. One of the things is maybe about being emotionally responsive is, I kind of think, at least being aware to pick up on feedback, and that I think it's also maybe for the organization to have a culture which allows that feedback to flow, so that leaders at least know if they're doing something that, was, emotionally responsive. I think over the years you've once or twice told me that I could have done something in a different way, that's the sort of feedback loop that you want to have sort of established, I guess.
And that, again, I think, thinking about client conversations that I've had, and I think this topic's come up again more and more in a post-pandemic world, and maybe the two things are linked, are this idea of feedback culture. So organisations I speak to seem to either want to build a feedback culture, a coaching culture, or preferably both together.
Yes.
So to reflect perhaps on the now, the hybrid world in which we now work, what would be, given what you know and what you understand about personality, what would be your top tips for organisations who want to build a culture of feedback, build a culture of coaching, and help their leaders get to a place where that can happen? Okay,
big question. I suppose at this point in the world, maybe the first thing I would sort of start by answering a different question, which hopefully will help. And that is that I think sometimes some of the things that we assume that are true in the post-pandemic world in terms of how people react weren't necessarily true. So, for example, I think there's an assumption, which would make sense, wouldn't it, that extroverts really fared badly because they were sort of locked down and they didn't want to be the case. In actual fact, my experience was probably the opposite, that actually the extroverts sort of found ways of carrying on. They went online, they did quizzes and tastings.
Onto the house party app.
House party app, that's right, don't remind me. And phoned their friends, and they did all of the things, and they sort of made a life out of it. Not as good a life, obviously, but they made a life out of it. But if you're an introvert, then sometimes the more natural thing was when you came into work, then you naturally got the sort of social, you might not have to say much, but there was a little bit of a buzz around you. You didn't want a party around you, but, coming in, smiling at somebody, seeing somebody, having a little chat and whatever else. And that was taken away. That little bit of an important social interaction was removed. And that meant that was quite difficult for some introverts. So it isn't necessarily the case, I think, that how we expect people to react. I mean, it was the biggest social experiment, obviously, that, on a global scale that you could possibly imagine. And we're still understanding some of the aspects and the features of it. And in fact, I was just back from the European Work and Organisational Psychology Conference, and our South African partner actually did a piece of research on giving feedback with Wave on personality and what virtual feedback, and learning some of the things that you had to do differently in terms of giving feedback in that situation. So, sorry, what was your question?
Big one. Given the world in which we now live, hybrid working, post-pandemic, what advice would you give to organisations, talent folk in organisations looking to build feedback culture, coaching culture, and helping their leaders get to a place where they can do that?
I think I mean, it sounds obvious, but you have to work at it, and you have to sort of work hard at it. There's some interventions you can do. So actually giving people feedback, doing self-awareness things where people share the results and understanding with each other. So teams genuinely understanding that, the person over there is an analyst and I'm an innovator, and that you're more likely to say what's wrong with it, and I'm likely to say, well, what else could we do with it to make it work? And understanding where people are coming from in terms of that is part of that sort of culture, because you're starting to talk to each other about how you're different from one another. And I think that's important. I mean, it's another aspect of sort of diversity and inclusion, is to understand and be accepting of people's personalities, not to actually necessarily look at somebody's personality who's different from your own and say that it's wrong.
Because it's easier to work with people who are similar to us, right? Yeah, absolutely.
And you have to remember that interacts with other aspects of D&I. So you might meet somebody from a different ethnic minority than you're in the majority position in that circumstance. Now, you're not going to dislike them because of that, but if they're very different from you in terms of creativity, or they're very critical or analytical, that might bug you. But that could be confused because you're not being inclusive about their personality, but they may assume that the reason for inclusion is different.
Yeah.
So, there is, inclusion interacts and goes beyond maybe the simple sometimes, and people think personality you don't have to be inclusive about, but you do.
You do, yeah. And I think in organisations, where I've seen that done really well, it's where there's been almost a kind of top-down approach. So your leadership team does what you've just described and sort of models that behaviour that is essentially we're all exploring how we're all similar, how we're all different, where are our strengths, where are our challenge areas, what might that mean for us in terms of team dynamics, how might we want to work together moving forward, and then it sort of cascades down the organisation. But I do think it kind of has to be modelled from the top, because I guess for some people it might feel a little vulnerable.
I think that's right. I think that's the best way to do it. But sometimes those cascade things sort of end up stopping. They sort of get
lose
down
momentum.
They sort of get from the board down to senior managers, and then it's a sort of weaker incarnation running through the organisation. So so to that point of you've got to work hard at it.
Yeah,
I think you're right. That's where you start if you possibly can. But it's not a bad thing even when you're doing it. If you imagine, even it's not a cascade down, but what somebody says when you're walking in and you've just started and you're doing your workshop or your exploration of difference and understanding, and then somebody says, no, the top team are doing it right now this day, same as you, so that kind of feels.
It sets the tone.
It sets the tone.
And I guess the other piece is around the right people in the right roles at leadership. So if your argument in the University of Life research suggests that it's very difficult to develop some of those behaviours that to do with sort of people-oriented leadership, I guess the answer to that is making sure you get folk who have those areas of strength into succession plans for those roles.
Yeah, or at least, sometimes, there's an assumption that everybody at the top has to have everything. They have to be, all of the characteristics. Now, it may be that, that for some of the roles, so long as you've got it across the teams and there's an understanding, for example, that your FD doesn't have it, or, some of that, whatever we're looking for in the people area, or whatever we're looking at in terms of emotional intelligence, sometimes somebody else, will work with them. They may have a people manager alongside them in their group or team if they recognize that. So it's sometimes not being honest sometimes, and not always assuming that one person has everything for a role, and sometimes thinking actually their strength in what matters for the role is so great, but we understand they've got something that they're lacking, and we need to shore that up somehow.
Final question. For any listeners who are sitting here thinking, I was actually just about to Google emotional intelligence tool, what do you want to tell them?
I suppose I would just think about what it is that you're trying to do. Back to your question, rather than look for a tool, start with what are you trying to solve for? And then ask your question, right, if I'm going to solve for that, what's the best way to get to that? So if it is a coaching culture, or if it is improving feedback, or if it is actually getting a read on whether my new graduates are going to be resilient enough in a big, because there's a big period of change coming for as we digitally transform our company. I don't want to end up having to lose a lot of graduates because they can't handle, all of the change process that's going to go through. Then, think about that. That's probably not an emotional intelligence questionnaire, but think about what it is that you should be using, or how you should be applying it. And sometimes you shouldn't be using a questionnaire at all, if I'm honest.
But if you're going to use one, you should use Wave.
Absolutely.
Rab, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks as always, Anna.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of The Deep Dive. If you have, please remember to like and subscribe to stay tuned for all our latest content. If you want more information on any of the topics you've heard today, check out the show notes for case studies, resources and articles. I've been Hannah Mullaney. See you next time on The Deep Dive.